thank you. The renaming of a Madison middle school is now in the works after first being discussed in March of last year.
The Madison Metropolitan Board of Education held a meeting tonight to talk about the potential names.
NBC 15's Cameron Kelly joining us from the newsroom. Cameron, what did you learn from this meeting?
Maria, John, there were 4 names that were brought forward tonight: Ezekiel Gillespie, Maya Angelou, and the son of Thomas Jefferson, Easton Hemmings, and his mother, Sally Hemmings. This discussion was brief. One of the main conversations was ensuring these names were after people who created legacies or contributed to Wisconsin. School board member Nichelle Nichols says the Hemmings have an interesting part of history, but those names do not align with other names the board has chosen in the past.
In my opinion, I don't think that those 2 names tie us in a more progressive stance around really celebrating individuals who have made significant contributions.
The board voted 6-1-0 on the top 2 names being Ezekiel Gillespie and Maya Angelou. They also reflected on a name change to Jefferson's neighboring school, Bell Phillips Memorial High School. The school was originally named James Madison Memorial High School, which was unanimously voted to change in November of 2021. Live in the newsroom, Cameron Kelly, NBC 15 News.